thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this work that I've been working on this year in the time of COVID. Stuck in my house here in Austin, Texas, 1,000 miles or 5,000 miles away from the Arab world. And so it's going to be nice to be able to share it with you, and hopefully you'll find it useful for different languages as well. A lot of this stuff is going to be very Arabic specific. Please feel free to interrupt me or send in a chat if I'm saying something that you don't understand. I always kind of just forget how specifically I'm talking about stuff, and I'll try to remember to be really specific about, or be really general about the topics that I'm talking about. So my topic tonight is going to be different ways that you can use social media to do cultural immersion in the time of COVID. And this was helpful this year as we've all been on lockdown, but it should continue to be helpful for anybody in a global language class who isn't able to just send students abroad all the time, or who just wants to include cultural text, authentic cultural texts in their classroom at any given time, and just kind of keep up with what's going on in the world. It's really wonderful to be able to use social media to be able to connect with all of these different countries and all of these different places. It's an amazing gift that we're only really starting to discover. The whole world has kind of learned how to use things like Instagram, and we all kind of speak a global social media language. And so a lot of these things are really universal, as we'll see tonight. But then they also come with things that are really specific to the cultures that are fascinating to look at in classroom groups. And so tonight I'm going to do kind of 3 anecdotal chapters of social media activities that you can do. The first one's going to be for Instagram. The second one's going to be for Facebook, and the third one is going to be for Twitter. You can, of course, go to any other social media site. I haven't taken the plunge into the deep, dark recesses of Arabic TikTok yet, but that's just because I've been working on other things. But I'm going to show you 3 examples of ways that you just ideas that I've come up with for exploring social media in kind of a structured way with students. But there's really this really general template, and the sky's the limit for the type of stuff that you guys want to be able to explore. So I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. So I'll start off by sharing this video from Instagram without any context. And I think so the very first image that we see in this video posted on Instagram is a couple of men in their 20s just hanging out, sleeping, kind of resting together. They've got maybe kind of a grin on their face. As the camera pulls away, you start seeing that they're in some sort of weird construction site. It pulls away a little bit farther, and then you realize all of a sudden that they're all hanging out in a cemetery. And as you pan over, you see this kind of printed up sign for I imagine is a friend of theirs who has died. And if you read any of the Arabic, you'll soon see that he died as a quote unquote martyr in a couple of political activities. So what is going on here? It's so complex. There are so many things that we could look at and see based on this one strange kind of out of context video, both linguistically and culturally. And so when we talk about cultural immersion, one of the definitions that I like for cultural immersion is trying to integrate into an unfamiliar community, interacting with local people, trying to understand the way that they live and how they engage in daily life activities. So I believe that watching a video like this, where we don't understand what's going on, where we have so many questions about who these people are, why they're acting in a certain way, what are they doing in a cemetery in broad daylight, answering all these questions or even having these questions is a form of cultural immersion. We can't ask them directly, but we can use all types of investigative strategies to try to figure out what's going on and piece it together in a way that's a little bit haphazard, open-ended, and really just bound to the types of questions that we're asking, that any form of cultural immersion that we would do in a actually going abroad or in an international setting, we would hope to be have just as many questions in front of us. And I don't think that we should think that the computer or the internet limits us to how deep we can get into a foreign culture, because digital culture is culture. We have billions of people that use the internet every single day, and they're creating tangible world cultures in various mediums online. They, as we'll see when we visit some of the sites on Instagram in just a few minutes, they recreate religious and spiritual and emotional experiences. They translate them into digital practices. And they're easy for us to read and they're easy for us to interact with. And there really is no, I would argue, no really strong difference or limitation from studying digital culture to culture in person. These are real people posting real things that we can look at and that we can interact with. And so in these three anecdotes that I'm going to give about this, we are, I believe, doing cultural immersion with digital culture. None of these examples that I give have us actually interacting with these cultures. It is a little bit a way we're just receiving them and we're just interpreting them. But there's no limit. We could, if you want, and I have before in classroom settings, had students come up with dummy accounts. I've done an academic article where I actively engaged with a group online. So it can be a two-way form of cultural interaction as well. And there's all types of really great scholarship on cultural immersion through interactive digital culture. But the examples that I'm going to give tonight are basically just having students explore almost like flies on the wall or ghosts kind of wandering around in the spectral realm, taking a look at some of this culture that's going on. So that being said, we're going to look at our first example here, and this is looking at religious tourism on Instagram. So the way that we do this is that we can go any place in the entire world that we want to using what Instagram calls geotags. And it's very, very easy. All you need to do is, like is the case with the video that we just watched of the men in the cemetery, is in your search bar on Instagram, you'll need an account on Instagram, but that's basically all that you'll need. You're going to just type in the name of a place. And so for this example, it's the cemetery of Wadi as-Salam, which is a cemetery in the city of Najaf, Iraq. The reason I chose this cemetery is because we were looking at the city of Najaf, but also because Wadi al-Salam is the world's largest cemetery. People visit it every single day, mainly people from Iraq, but also from the Shia community worldwide. Before the age of COVID, you had people coming from South Asia. You had people coming from places in Southeast Asia. Depending on the post, you could kind of do a little bit of detective work and see where everybody was coming from. There were definitely a few European tourists as well that I saw. But you click on this little icon here. It looks kind of like an upside down teardrop, and this is what's called a geotag. And so what it does is it's going to pull up every single picture or every single post that people have marked as being from this place. So if we zoom out, this is the Wadi al-Salam cemetery in Najaf, Iraq. And all of a sudden, we have hundreds and thousands of pictures and videos that were taken in the cemetery today. The most recent picture that we have, let's see, this was just posted an hour ago. So we aren't, looking in an old textbook or an encyclopedia article about the cemetery Wadi al-Salam. We're, for all intents and purposes, there right now. This happened today. Hundreds of people posted on this today. If an event takes place in the cemetery, we can kind of piece together what happened just by looking at different people's photos and videos. And so there's three main aspects that you can look at with students when you're doing this kind of cultural immersion in a place like the cemetery. The first is the content of the videos and the pictures themselves. This one's a video. I could go on for a half an hour or for an hour just with the music that's being played on the radio of this car that's driving through the cemetery. This is a specific type of religious song called a nasheed. And you can kind of get cued into that by hearing the clapping in the background, this kind of rhythmic clapping. What is that? What does that have to do with religious practices and burials in this cemetery? What do we know about Shia Islam and its burial rituals? There's all types of questions that we can ask and we can look into just based on that. Let's just, I haven't seen any of these pictures. I'm just kind of clicking on random here, but you never know what you're going to get, and it's always kind of exciting. We have here the second part. So we have the video or the picture. We also have the caption, what the person themselves writes. It's always really, really fascinating because we have a written language. For Arabic specifically, it's always really interesting because you'll have a mix of formal register Arabic, informal register Arabic. One caption alone can provide you a text for an entire hour-long class. In our class earlier this week, we had a poem about mourning composed by the person in the picture. And we had a little bit of a conversation about what about this poem made it in the Iraqi dialect? What are some of the sound changes that happen? How do we know that it was written by this guy? Well, we were able to kind of piece together that the guy had a very like emo look. He was smoking a cigarette and he had a long scarf. He was looking off camera. And the poem that he had posted, I mean, it was about his deceased relative, but it was also very, very emotional in kind of a quote unquote emo way. And so there was a lot to just kind of link between what was written in the text and what was written in the picture. It was like this really, really nice correspondence back and forth between them. One of the other things that we were able to find was religious invocations. So when someone visits a holy place, there's a certain type of specific language or phrases that you use to wish people well when they're on these types of visits. More things that we can comment and have conversations in class about and kind of guide students towards learning about it. If you hover over these pictures, you can see how many people have liked the picture. This picture, for example, is 399, but then you want the real meat and potatoes of this, which is comments. So 11 people have responded to this person who is mourning a relative. And you can see with a mix of emojis, comment or phrases that are both stock phrases and personalized phrases, you really, really get a sense not only of just specific language questions, but many more interesting cultural aspects, like simply how do people in Iraq, or specifically in the Shia tradition of Iraq, how do they mourn? How do people offer their condolences? How do people celebrate the life of their past ones? You know, we talked in class this week about usually in social media in the United States, people post pictures of the deceased that are living, from them laughing or smiling or having good times. Much less often do we have pictures of people actually mourning at the cemetery in front of the tombstone. The reason why this actually happens much more in these photos, specifically in Wadi as-Salam, is because Wadi as-Salam is such a famous and important kind of pilgrimage or religious site in the Shia tradition. So you can talk about those cultural differences as well. So those are three of the aspects that you can look at, just checking out these things. You can also just kind of do a lot of really interesting comparing and contrasting, and really build in from kind of inferences, really important and interesting socioeconomic information about the type of people that are taking these pictures. And so this is from another religious site in the city of, or so this is in Damascus, Syria. This is the Saeed Zainab Mosque and Shrine. We can look at the clothing of the person on the left and the way that they're posing for the camera, the quality of the photo. We don't look at the caption here, but we can also see that if we wanted to, and contrast it with the picture on the right of someone who's wearing a much more traditional garb, who's facing away from the camera, who seems to be surrounded by more of there's a cleric in the background there. And we can compare and contrast these two people and with the kind of experiences that they're having. and how they are communicating religiosity and spirituality and piety, faith, all of these types of things, how they're translating those sentiments into quote unquote Instagram language. So Instagram language, there's just kind of a universal aesthetic or look to how an Instagram picture should look. Bold colors, simplified, adventurous, usually a person in the center looking off into the thing, wearing linen clothes, looking very, very cool. That's someone who kind of speaks a kind of globalized Instagram visual language, like I would argue this guy on the left. Whereas this person on the right, it's not as nicely framed of a picture. It's much more centered on the actual place that they are. So you can do a little bit of this kind of semiotic analysis with students as well. And it really, just like if you were wandering on a street or if you were visiting a shrine in the Middle East, you'd be making these sort of hypotheses and inferences based on things as basic as the clothes that people were wearing, the things that people were eating, the types of cars that people were getting in and out of, all those types of things. So I'll give you a little example here. I came up with a checklist. Some of the questions that you can have while perusing, scrolling through geotagged pictures of Saeed Zainab Mosque. And it depends on how much you want to guide your students, whether you want to be right with them or you want to just let them cut them loose and have them kind of use a little bit of a scavenger hunt format. So this is much more of a scavenger hunt thing to try to get them to look at something that they don't understand. I gave them some vocabulary before they went off here. For example, there's a lot of cultural things that are really specific that they wouldn't know about. There's a lattice structure that withholds the tomb of a holy person in the Islamic tradition, and that's called a darih. And that's mentioned a lot in these comments. If people don't know what that word is, they're going to be a little bit lost. And so I gave that to them before the activity, and then when they're actually in the activity, they are looking for specific instances of people having interactions with the darih. So here is the darih, and I asked them to look specifically for a video of someone applying perfume to the tomb. So they'll spray some on their hand and they'll rub it onto the tomb, and that has a whole religious significance. Again, more things that you can kind of talk about, and just really, really interesting cultural information that students can kind of learn. In the lesson that we did a few weeks ago, we did another compare and contrast. Saeed Zainab is a religious site specifically for Shia in the south of the city of Damascus. It's a much more kind of working class and kind of religiously conservative environment in that place, and you can totally get that from just looking at these pictures. So then in contrast, I had students go to another religious pilgrimage site outside of the city of Damascus, which is a monastery to the north of town. And we have much more of the kind of universal Instagram language. When you scroll through your Instagram, these are much more of the kind of pictures that you see. People trying to look cute, people trying to look like they're having a really great time, people trying to look like they're not posing for the camera, those types of things. So we talked a little bit in the class about what is the differences in both the history of these two religious places that would make it so that people had much different approach to taking pictures at these places. Do we get a sense that the vibe or the mood of these places is much more different? Is one more strict than the other? How do people actually express things like spirituality or faithfulness in different locations using Instagram? So I'm not going to scroll through here now, but there are actually several photos of this place, this monastery in Damascus, where people are having a spiritual or religious experience. But it's much more based on the fact that this monastery is built up in a rugged mountain range that overlooks just the desert, and it's actually also part of a nature reserve. And so a lot of people were expressing kind of a deep spiritual experience, being very remote and isolated, which in a lot of ways is really cool because it's kind of the whole point of a monastery, specifically this type of Jesuit monastery that's supposed to be all about, seclusion, hermitage, removal. And it's really cool seeing how this very, very old structure kind of dictates the way that people express their spirituality, even on Instagram. So it's another argument for the way in which digital culture is exactly just like, analog culture, I guess you could say. So those are just some of the examples of things that you can do using Instagram geotags. Almost every tourist site in the world now has a geotag. If you're teaching Indonesian, if you're teaching Chinese, if you're teaching Italian, you're going to have things that you can look at, sites that people can visit, and it's going to be messy, just like the real world is. So maybe you're trying to find beautiful examples of very literary French going to the Eiffel Tower. Might not actually work out for you because the majority of people who go to the Eiffel Tower, it's everyone around the world. So you're going to get an enormous barrage of languages and cultures and mixing and matching that are that you're not really in control of, but it's always an interesting exploration. Whereas if you maybe chose a kind of an underground speakeasy bar or something in Paris, you get much more of like a local, real quote unquote French clientele. And then you could look in their comments or see their videos and get the much more, strictly French texts that you wanted. Which is just exactly the case if you went to Paris in the real world. If, when I lived in New York City, I would, we never went to the Statue of Liberty. We never went to the Empire State Building. We were looking for the real authentic experiences. And so you do a little bit of exploring, you do a little bit of looking around, and you can find really, really interesting places to explore using Instagram. The second example, I'll move on. We're going to move on. This is Syria and Iraq that I just did. We're now going to move on to Morocco to talk about affinity groups on Facebook. So an affinity group is an loosely organized social or cultural setting in which the work of teaching tends to be shared by many people in many locations who are connected by a shared interest or passion. So one of the really, really wonderful things that you can do on Facebook to not only explore digital culture or just global language culture, but specifically look on subcultures within these cultures and to really fight back against ideas that all of Arab culture is the same or all of Chinese culture is the same, is to look at specifically kind of niche affinity groups on Facebook. And trust me, all you got to do is just look in the search bar and you will find anything you want in terms of interests that people have. For a little while, I was getting really, really deep into the ostrich breeding clubs in Egypt, and it was fascinating. And you could do a whole paper on it. I have done an entire peer review article about affinity groups for people learning Ottoman Turkish online and the memes that they create up and things like that. But you can find, it's kind of up to you, find a subculture or a specific group that is showing really specific, interesting, doing interesting cultural work, learning work, hobbies, stamp collecting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, online. And you can just dive into a whole world of people sharing things that is just infinitely interesting to look at. So I'll give you one example. I'm teaching a course this summer. It's kind of a survey of the Arab world. And the chapter on Morocco is going to be focusing on the ways that Moroccans have fought back against colonial history by trying to recover or restore, as he's saying here, but just take Moroccan history back for themselves. And so one of the things we're looking at is a famous author and filmmaker, Ahmed Bouanani. We're also looking at this famous book that was written, I believe, in the 70s by a guy named Larawi, who kind of challenges received narratives of history from the colonial administration, things like that. This stuff can all be a little bit abstract, and we're looking at kind of high literary and philosophical examples of the ways that Moroccan intellectuals have what is the word I'm looking for? Reappropriated? Not reappropriated. Taken back their history. Someone's coming to tell me.
Reclaim.
Reclaim, thank you. How have and are Moroccans reclaiming their history from received colonial narratives about Moroccan history? Well, there are no shortage online, on Facebook specifically, of affinity groups interested in Moroccan history. Moroccan nostalgia. Moroccan, as we say in Arabic, ayam el zaman, the days of yore. So here's the very first example. There's a whole list of groups that I could go through. But I'm being wary of time here. This is Morocco from the ayam el zaman. This is the Morocco of the days of yore. People on Facebook, you probably know this if you have a Facebook account, love to share pictures from their childhoods when everything was better than it is now. This is kind of a universal way that people use social media. And so if you show your students how people are doing this in other countries, I think they'll understand the context very, very quickly. So here we have on the left, we got bell-bottom jeans, we got afros, we got very, very wide lapels. This is obviously the 70s. In the comment here, they're kind of, giving the context of what it is they're looking at. People are just saying, oh my gosh, these are such beautiful days. The city was so beautiful back then. We can talk about, we can use this as a jumping into talking about what was Morocco like in the 70s? Were things actually that beautiful? What's the role of nostalgia? What about the years of lead? There's so many different ways that we can see how real, actual people think about and remember their history on Facebook, which is, so this is more of a, this is like old farts remembering the good old days. There's another affinity group on Facebook that's called History and Civilization of Morocco. It's a huge group. It's got 500 members, and they share historical documents, videos, pictures, stuff that you, in your wildest dreams, wouldn't just be able to find if you were doing your own research. Well, here it is right at your fingertips. People just pour stuff on this all day long. And I'm just going to show you two examples that you can use in your classroom in a really interesting way. The one on the left, it says, this is how we used to have our like Eid celebrations at the end of Ramadan. Who remembers this? I'm not from Morocco. I've never been to Morocco. I don't know what these little cakes are on these trays. My mother never bathed me with a kettle. I don't know, does this kid have juice boxes next to his bed? I don't really understand any of this stuff, but I'm very curious. And it's always really interesting to see what other people are nostalgic for. But the thing that's universal about this is everybody is very nostalgic for kind of banal stuff from their childhood. And this is a thing that you can really get into history and show with people. You can look in the comments and see how people remember these things. People will always argue that some things are better than others. And so it's simultaneously a brand new cultural context for students, but also one that's completely familiar to them. Here on the right, we have a picture of Tangiers in 1964. It's a beautiful black and white picture. It got a little bit cut off here on my slide, but that's just because there's not enough space. But we can talk about so many things from just this one picture that, someone else has shared. Why is this in Spanish? Why is all the street signs written in 3 different languages? What was going on in Tangier in 1964? What's the special role that Tangier has in Moroccan history? What is it with it now? These are all jumping off points that you don't control what you're going to find when you open up these affinity places, but it can always lead you to really, really interesting conversations. That's for guided practice. There's also, again, just like Instagram, letting the students free to kind of roam and explore on their own and to come back with things that they have questions about, whether it's linguistic or whether it's cultural. So again, a lot of the times, the more time I spend on social media and the more time I spend specifically on Morocco affinity groups and Morocco social media in general, the more it all comes together. And it's just like any sort of cultural immersion. I just start figuring it out because I start getting all the references. I start understanding the slang and I start understanding language. You just piece it together by spending hours just looking through all this stuff. That being said, this next meme that was shared on another Moroccan affinity group, I do not understand. So this is the King Mohammed II of Morocco. He was the leader of Morocco from the 50s to like 1999. I don't know who this is. I'm assuming this is the founder of Morocco. My Moroccan history is a little bit rusty. I have no idea who this is, and I do not know what this flag is, but this is a meme format that is universal. The girl you like, her father, her brother, her grandfather, her ancestor, like you kind of get the logic of what it is that's going on here. But the good thing about this meme it provides a wonderful opportunity to look at people fighting online, which is always such a rich, rich place for looking at language online. What are you talking about? Stupidity. The person next in the comments in beautiful Moroccan dialect gives a whole explanation of why this meme is stupid. Someone else explains why it's stupid. And then someone calls him a dirty butt, I think. Sal'an is like a dirty ass in French, I believe. Talking about Alawite history, all the taboos in Moroccan culture about the monarchy. But you also get something very, very important that you might not get in an Arabic textbook, which is how language actually exists in the real world, which is mixed. Here we have French. French is everywhere on the Moroccan internet, as it is in Moroccan real life. Here we have someone. Let me see if I can see this right. Speaking in no, this is not formal Arabic. We have people speaking in dialect. This is perfect examples of dialect that I could go spend a half hour with students looking over this and seeing why this is specific, why this is good, what are the arguments that they're making, what are the languages, and it's all very authentic texts. But it's also written, so it's not escaping me. I have it right here. So we can look at people fighting online is the absolute best because it's always rhetorical, it's always referential, cultural. It's just always so rich. And so you just kind of look around on these affinity groups, just looking for fights because that's where all the really, really good stuff happens. When people are just saying, "Oh, I love the days of yore; they were so beautiful," like that's nice. But when people are talking about the king being a bastard, well, that's when things really, really get good. And I can't emphasize enough, this stuff is so important and serious, even though it's things like memes on Facebook. Because in all of the research that I was doing about Morocco before our project was canceled, and now we're doing things like this online, the discourse around the king is taboo, and it is at the center of Moroccan identity, Moroccan politics, Moroccan controversies. If you open up a Moroccan newspaper, there's something about the dignity and the role of the king every single day. And so this really strikes at the heart of, what is going on in Moroccan culture and what's really, really important now. But it's translated into a language and into a format that we all understand, which is memes and fights on Facebook. So that's one of the things that I really, really like about it. It's really, really interesting. Lastly, I'm going to go to what I call political arcology on Twitter. This is the most technical of the three topics that I'm looking at. I find that most people are the least familiar with Twitter. And I'm just going to kind of give you the general thing, but I can give you more specific instructions of how to do this online as well. So the interesting thing about Twitter, and as it pertains to cultural immersion, is the concept of context collapse. So context collapse refers to the infinite audience possible online, as opposed to the limited group of persons that you would normally interact with face to face. So unlike Instagram or Facebook, Instagram, where you can be in a specific location and you can actually see pictures and videos and it's tied to a real person, as opposed to Facebook, where you have affinity groups that have select members, specific places, they have walls around them. Twitter has been described as the entire world inside of one large convention hall with no walls. And so people joke all the time, they sign on to Twitter in the morning and it takes them like 15 minutes of scrolling around to figure out what people are fighting about. And it's a little bit of, it's basically doing cultural immersion backwards. You're given the very, very specific instance of something and you have to try to figure out what's going on. So you get the immediate thing first and then you have to figure out all the context behind it backwards. So the example that I give is this tweet here. This is a tweet from March of 2019. I translated it in English below, but it's not really helpful because it doesn't really make any sense. The people refuse military rule under the turban or over the clouds or on a chair behind him. I didn't know what this meant, and I had to poke around for a very, very long time to realize that these three phrases, under the turban, over the clouds, or on the chair behind him, they rhyme, And each one of those things is an oblique reference to the military leader of the three countries of Sudan, Egypt, and Algeria. Then I had to look up what this movement Shabab 6 April was. It is a political group in Egypt that was voicing its support for political protests that were going on in Algeria in 2019, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what I say, why I would call it political archaeology, or just archaeology in general, like digital archaeology. You undig this weird object and you have no idea what it is. And you have to spend all this time piecing together what its context was, like what it means, what was its role in the society that you got it from. And so unlike Instagram, where if you go to this geotag, you just get the stuff that you had on the day that was there. Same thing with Facebook, you're just shown the most recent stuff. Twitter has really, really nice tools for advanced search in a way that these other ones don't. And so to really take advantage of what makes Twitter interesting, we need to kind of learn some of the basic tools of using advanced search. So one of the ways that we can do this in a really, really interesting way is to look at protests and protest culture. And so this tweet specifically is an artifact from kind of an ongoing set of protests that in the country of Algeria, which is called Hirak, which is a protest movement against so many things, but it was tipped off by the long-term president of Algeria deciding he wanted to run for a 5th term in office. And it led to widespread protest all around the country against him specifically, but also against a corrupt and very ossified political culture in the country. But it unrolled over time. So it first had these specific political demands that widened with time. Then there was, shifting political demands. There was a whole chronology of events that were going on. And so the thing about tweets is, on one hand, they're so specific. I'm arguing with somebody and I'm fighting back against something in this one really, really specific context, on this one really, really specific day, in this one place, about this one thing that in this huge political movement. It's listening to one voice in a crowd on one day. But then you can find that exact one little thing again and try to put all the context back into place for what it was there for. And so if you can figure out how to do an advanced search, and if you can give the entire historical and political lesson to the students to give them the background of what's going on here, then they can truly be back in the middle of the crowd years ago and see everything that was going on. And it can be a really, really fascinating experience, but it takes a little bit of work to set it up. So just as an example, in the way that protest signs are awesome texts for kind of studying and unpacking things, everyone comes out with their cheekiest posters. Here's one written in Algerian Arabic. I translated it for students from Algerian Arabic to formal Arabic. That's just a language lesson right there. We can spend a half hour doing that. And that's also true when we're looking at individual tweets and looking at what their language is and what they're referring to. But on Twitter, if you go to advanced search, you can search for so many different things. You can search for tweets sent on a specific date or on a range of dates, specific places, by specific people, to specific people, tweets that were that generated controversy, so the ones that had a certain amount of comments, tweets that had several likes, so I'm only picking the most popular ones. I can do tweets that only had pictures. I can do tweets that only had certain hashtags. Hashtags are kind of slogans. I mean, they're pretty much familiar to everybody, but they're slogans that people add to tweets to make sure that they're included in specific conversations, which works great for this type of historical archaeology that we're doing. And so the sky's the limit with all the different types of things that you can try to find. So the one that I did is I'm looking for people who use the hashtag no to the 5th term. So this is Bouteflika, the president of Algeria. I want to find people who use this specific political slogan turned into a hashtag no to the 5th term, written in English or Arabic, so you can choose the language that it's written in as well, between the dates of February 1st, 2019 and March 31st, 2019, which is kind of generally considered as like the first phase of the Hirak protest movement in Algeria. And I want it so that at least 10 people liked the tweet. So that I'm not finding kind of just garbage, I'm finding kind of the main people that are in this conversation. And so that's basically what this code is here. You can either type in this specific code in an advanced search bar, or you can kind of go through this list of things and just kind of click through toggled options. But what it does is it pulls up a very specific list of historical tweets, and it looks a little bit like this. So here's someone on March 12th. They said, Bouteflika says, all right, no fifth term. I will just extend the fourth term. So we have a little bit of sarcasm here. Long live the mighty Algerian people. This one actually, this person here has a check mark by their name. So I went and looked. It was a very popular tweet. It had a lot of responses to it. It had to do with the fact that he's actually a Palestinian writer. And so there was a lot of things about there. You also want to look up the people. You want to look up the context that they're having. There's a lot more things that you can kind of look at as well. I won't even go into all of the like kind of metadata that you can go into. You can look at networks and see how people are involved with each other and what groups they're associated with. It's really, really interesting. But just for this specific advanced search, we can just see what people were actually saying on the days of these protests that had to do with the specific hashtag. And you really, really get a sense of the discourse. So this is a specific discourse and a specific language, specific slogans, specific sarcasm, specific self-righteousness, specific use of language, specific use of puns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so much stuff in here that you can have, and you can all just put it together as a kind of archive of a specific historical moment. One of the activities that I found was really, really interesting for this, and this is a really good kind of advanced language skill, was trying to have students tell the difference between real tweets made by real people and ones that were made by what we call electronic flies. Electronic flies in the Algerian context is basically bots created by the Algerian government and the security services to just kind of like hover in and bother people that were making these political points. And so I read a couple articles about them. And later in this year, when they actually had elections that Bouteflika was not part of, there was a couple hashtags that were being used by bots and trolls, namely not in my name and Algeria votes. And so I, as a little activity for myself, tried to find bots. So what you do is you're basically looking for quote unquote inauthentic language. Maybe it's in Arabic, maybe it's in grammatically correct Arabic, but how can you tell that it's actually fake? How do you tell that it's not real? So these were, sorry, it's going to be too small to see here, but here's 4 examples that I was able to identify of Arabic tweets that were bots, that weren't real. One of them was made by this person who only started their Twitter account the month that they tweeted their fake tweet. They don't really have any followers, no picture of themselves, and they only had like 5 tweets, and they're all using these kind of bot-like hashtags. And so a really specific activity that you can do, and I guarantee for almost any political conflict that you can find throughout history, Twitter's long and labored history, you will find bots. Is a really good activity for students is to have them play Find the Bots or Find the Trolls. And again, that is a really great example of seeing something that we all understand, which is just kind of like the universal or the global forms and kind of genres of internet culture, things like bots and trolls, which I'm sure all of us have had experience with in our lives online. And then putting it in the specific context of something like the protest movement in Algeria. Like, how does a bot behave? What are some of the tropes that it looks for? What is a hyper-nationalist or a racist or a chauvinist? Like, what do they look like in the Algerian context? Like, what does it mean to be super nationalist in the Algerian context, but also to be a bot. Well, you can go and take a look at what that would look like. So I think the Twitter archaeology is a little bit the most technically challenging, but as opposed to the cultural excursions on Instagram and Facebook, which are mostly looking at what happened today, this is one where you can really peer into the past in really, really interesting ways. There's been a lot of really, really great work, specifically in the Arab context. The number one example of this is the January Revolution in Egypt. People have actually taken this very seriously and archived tweets through time to kind of as the best record and archive of this revolution. And so you can do it for much more recent history, or you can actually go back to the very dawn of Twitter history, which I think was like 2008, or I guess 2011 would basically be about the first example that you could do this from. But it's really, really interesting, the things that you can see. And that's not even to say anything of just looking at contemporary stuff on Twitter. You can always have the students, there's a little toggle on Twitter that you can just say, show me tweets from Algeria today. And then you can see what are the trending topics, what are people talking about today, what celebrities are they mad at in Algeria, and what are kind of the hashtags and the slogans they're going to. So the cool thing about Twitter is you can go back in time, like the other ones that you can't, but you're also just as well welcome to do a little bit of cultural exploring with the conversations that are happening now. And yeah, that's the stuff that I have for now. I'd be happy to take any questions about this, or I can show more specifically an example of how any of these things work.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I just reiterate, if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to either unmute your mic, or you can also type them in the chat and I can ask your questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Arpin. I was wondering if you really should be active on social media, and how much time usually takes you to find one of these materials, and not the question part that you put all together, but just like to find a level appropriate or culture related, a picture, a video or something, and how long does it take you usually if you are not spending a lot of time on social media? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. The one thing I maybe didn't mention is a little bit of the ethical dimensions of this. So sometimes students don't feel comfortable using their personal accounts. Most of the time you can just use dummy accounts, and most of these things, the reason why these aren't interactive is because I wanted to create things that students could just be flies on the wall for, not electronic flies, but flies on the wall. Mm-hmm. The thing you are right to notice, a lot of these activities require a lot of work on the part of the person preparing them, because there's a lot of social media out there that's really boring, and you want to find things that are actually engaging for people.
That's true.
So I'm personally interested in these things. I spend a lot of time on social media myself because like I said, I'm all the way out in Texas. And so a way for me to feel like I'm still part of what's going on in the rest of the world is to try to engage and do cultural immersion these ways. A lot of just kind of knowing what to look for. So for example, I know from having spent time in the past, and also when I was doing my research on Morocco, I knew that people have a lot of affinity groups about history. There's a lot of history buffs in Morocco. It's kind of a thing. And so I just knew that there would be that in, and sometimes it's a little bit actually easier than you'd think. You spend 5 minutes and you're like, I wonder if this thing exists. And sure enough, there are a whole slew of ostrich aficionados and ranchers in Egypt that you can immediately find. So I would play around with some of the things that you're looking for. I would do a little bit of exploring ahead of time. But one of the things that you can really explain to students as well is that this is just as messy as real life, because it is real life. And so, we're going to be looking at some things that we don't understand. I might not be able to answer every single one of your questions, because there's some things about this that are even going to be over my head. But if that's just kind of the caveat that you give to it, I think that you can really have kind of an interesting time. And students, I think, really appreciate the fact that this is kind of, live ammunition, cultural immersion, rather than something that's kind of prepackaged.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
I'm just looking at some of the comments in the chat. One is that it can be very boring if no one's fighting sometimes, which I think you were just speaking about. And then also that these are going to be very useful resources for some high school credit virtual programs that are being developed for CLV.
Awesome.
I have a question about how you deal with situations where students grossly misinterpret something, because you want to encourage them to explore, but a lot of times a lot of prejudices come out, stereotypes, or sort of these kind of pejorative readings of things, and how you manage that.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I ask students, like if they have an interpretation of why things are going on that way, a lot of times I really say to them, like, well, where are you getting that from? Where is it coming from? Do you have an article that references that? Is there some sort of Wikipedia article that kind of references that? A lot of times I don't understand the things that I'm going on online, and I have to do a lot of Google sleuthing, and that's kind of the way that it comes from. And so one of the ways that you can kind of protect yourself a little bit is just having the student, because we're online, we're in the real world online, you can say, like, where are you getting that from? Like, show me a little bit of evidence from somewhere else, some other source, showing that that's where that you're getting that from. And a lot of times, because we are in, because we're a little bit, there is just a lot of like really weird toxic stuff online. It's a little bit inevitable. And so I also just prepare students for that too. Like, it's a little bit dangerous out there, like just content warning for this type of stuff. But hopefully, you'll, the more that you're exposed to it, I think it's all a really great antidote for kind of stereotypes and biases that people have. I think that specifically with Instagram, like, because everybody around the world is taking the exact same selfies, I think it's such an incredible way to break down barriers. Like, oh, are you telling me they go to coffee shops and get like huge frappuccinos and just like lazily sit around with their friends all day? They're just like us. So I think that's a really cool part about it as well.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see here the martyrs one is an example that gets bogged down sometimes. That's totally true. I mean, you're also getting a very the Shia context specifically. I didn't go into any of the pictures tonight, but there's many examples of people who post themselves performing like kind of ceremonies in which they strike themselves with chains, with swords. They make themselves bleed. It's kind of like a form of self-flagellation. You definitely want to give some context before that, because the people in Instagram, they don't know that they're broadcasting to the entire world, and they don't know that there's a classroom of American students watching them. And so they're performing a religious ritual for a specific religious context. And so you need to fill in as much of that context as possible, either during or before, because yeah, a lot of these things can be like, whoa, if they're not given any of that context. So yeah, it can be tricky. That's why you definitely want to poke around a little bit beforehand by yourself.
I see Anna has raised her hand.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a question. What like, I just looking for activities with Instagram and Facebook for students. So what you will recommend? I heard what you said already, but what else, like how else could we use those resources?
I would probably, the first step is, how do you use social media to keep in touch with people that you know that live in the country of the language that you teach? Like, what are the things that you're interested in? Like, the most boring daily pictures of people with their kids, people at a birthday party, people at a wedding, that stuff is fascinating when you're learning a language, because every part of it has to do with culture. Like, what do you say when someone gets married in another language? What do people wear? What is that thing that they're dancing and doing? So many things that to us in our daily life would seem totally boring. If you focus in on it, it can really, really actually be fascinating. And doing things that you're already familiar with, or that people that you know are already doing, I think already gives you kind of a leg up to kind of explain. Mm-hmm. And anything, on one hand, you have things that are exotic and interesting and unique and special, like we're going to the cemetery in Jaffa, like, ooh, that's fascinating. But on the other hand, we have things that are so authentic. Like this is real life, and we get to put it in a bottle, and we get to just look at it from all sides. We get to pick apart the language. Oh, here's a phrase. I wasn't lying when I told you that at Ramadan, this is what people say when they get together for the evening meal. Like, this is real. This is what they actually say, and here's the proof. And I think students really, really appreciate that, because there's always the problem with our textbooks and with our classes, that it's always a little bit artificial, because we want to kind of teach the language and we want to teach the grammar. And so I think from my experience, students love authentic texts because it makes them feel like, this is all for a purpose. Like I'm doing this right. And here's my payoff, because they're actually doing it like they told me that they were going to be doing it.
Do you encourage them to post or just to reply to actual people on Instagram or Facebook? Do they have this connection? Like, did they try like this?
There's a lot of really, really great work of people who do much more interactive things. There are people who, there's examples of people who they try to post in the language that they're doing. And that's really great, like kind of self-reinforcing practice, because it's the perfect thing. Like if people online can't understand your language, it doesn't have to be grammatically correct. It has to be comprehensive. And so this really, really great way to emphasize the communicative approach. Like, can you carry on conversations? Can you get into fights online? Well, then it means your language is going pretty good. And there's some really interesting studies about that. I didn't go into that in this, but there's a lot of people doing really, really great work out there for it. It just comes down to the ethical issues of like, you probably don't want students having to use their own personal accounts for these types of things, especially if you're going to be having them do things that would be political or kind of controversial or whatever. But you can have students even just look for pen pals, join an affinity group on Facebook, just offer kind of nice comments to people's general open things. Like there's plenty of stuff that you can do, that you can have them screenshot or share, or even just talk about. One of the things that you can kind of keep it really safe with, and I've seen this before in the classroom, have the students not screenshot or tell you exactly what they did when they were interacting online, but just write a journal or a log about their experience. What went well? What didn't go well? What kind of what examples of kind of self-repair did they do in their language? What wasn't working, and those types of things. And I think that helps them still retain a level of privacy, but also you have something to help them with when it comes to their language study. And the one other thing I'll say about that is specifically for native English speakers, they're going to get a lot of really, really positive reaction a lot of the times from other people online. And I think it can be a really great experience that they just be like, hey, like I'm in this ostrich affinity group, like I'm learning Arabic. It can be a really, really positive experience if they are totally open, like, hey, I'm a student, I'm learning this language, this is why I'm here. Those types of things can be a really positive experience. I once had someone a million years ago, I was used to go in chat rooms in Arabic, and people wouldn't talk to me, and I started pretending like I was a woman. This is like 2002, so this is back in the old days of chat rooms. And they were so happy that I was learning Arabic that one of them proposed marriage to me. So it can be a really positive experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answer.
Sorry, I was a little bit late. I was in another meeting, so I don't know if you talk about Clubhouse. I was wondering if you suggest Clubhouse for teaching languages, or because of the live environment that it has. Thank you.
Yeah, I most certainly would. I mean, I don't think that there is a single social media platform that wouldn't be good for cultural immersion, period, because every single one almost is, if it's not based in language, it's based in culture and semiotics. So the dumbest meme is cultural learning. The stupidest TikTok is cultural learning. Like I've never ever seen a text online that wasn't valuable in some way. And I didn't go into all the other ones. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with them. There's so many new ones that come out, but they almost always, it's interesting how a lot of them, they don't actually have that much of a, they don't take that much long to learn, because they're kind of based on the logic of the social media platform that came before them. And so you can kind of figure it out pretty well. And I really encourage students, especially, you know, our students are more digitally native than we are. They're always a little bit of a step ahead of us. And I always put the ball in their court. Like, not only do I want you to be doing cultural immersion, but I want you to be teaching me this platform and showing me like what's going on with that. So I don't use Clubhouse. I've seen about it, I've heard about it, and I've seen people specifically in my context use it for Arabic. And so I have like no reservations that it would be a great way to do it. You just have to kind of come up with the rules and the boundaries for how you can kind of be there to help students along with the specific language aspects to it. I also, Clubhouse is, it's like where people, they're having live conversations. Is that basically what it is? One of the things that I would say about that is that I love for students to be in over their heads. And I love them to be taking part in conversations where they don't understand what's going on, because that's exactly what cultural immersion is like. And so if I was like, hey, go listen to this conversation and have no idea what's going on, perfectly like rich, wonderful cultural experience for them to have. And I would probably, you want to always look for what we call affordances, like what are the specific advantages of this technology that we can really harness for pedagogy. And from just what I know about Clubhouse, one of the things would just be like, have 8 people talking in your ear all at the same time in a language you don't understand. You're going to get so much out of it by osmosis. It's going to be worth your while.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's super energy and great engagement by everybody. Appreciate all the questions from everybody. Very insightful for me as well, as somebody who doesn't get to go to a language classroom. And being able to hear what you do in English in our Arabic programs is, of course, really fun. So thank you very much for taking the time tonight. If other questions come up, we can leave the room open if you're willing to stay around a little bit, or people can write to us and we can connect them with you as well, if you're open to that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you again, Shams, for organizing this whole series this semester. It's been a great series of 5 professional development workshops, and we've had attendees from the various language training centers and other organizations, institutions, which has been really exciting for us. And we look forward to putting together another program for next year. We'll see what we come up with. And thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.